But speaking of being torn apart, another example of the paranoia and the political posturing, the bizarre mismanagement, politicians claiming to be tough and just wrecking people's lives. Politicians who have turned a serious problem, the coronavirus, into a human disaster. Now, incredibly, Australians are still banned from leaving our own country unless we get official permission. I, for instance, would need a certificate from the government to go and see my son and daughter overseas, and it's really killing me. Now, other people, it's worse. They need permission to go overseas to a funeral, a wedding, a dying relative, a job. Now, 47,000 people have so far been so generously allowed to leave Australia, but 16,000 have not. And I don't know how many others didn't bother trying because they knew they wouldn't get approval. That's incredible. We're not free to choose for ourselves whether we can leave. How on earth have Australians, who are supposed to be larrikins, let governments get that much control over our lives? Well, that's because I think we've allowed ourselves to be scared stupid by a virus that's not as deadly as we're told. And there's another reason, one that's caused so much more grief. We're not allowed out because we're not allowed back in. There's actually a limit on how many Australians can come home, about 4,000 a week. Can you believe that? And that limit has trapped 23,000 Australians overseas with Christmas coming. They can't fly back home. Some are running out of money. They're desperate. Some can't come back home to family that very badly need them here. I'll talk to one of the trapped Australians in a minute. Now, the Morrison government says, well, this limit on people returning, 4,000 a week, is because the states won't let in more people than they actually have room for in their quarantine hotels.
It's a function of the state health directive that people need to go into hotel quarantine for 2 weeks, but then putting a cap on the number of beds that are available.
It's true, the states have set very tough limits on how many people can come back in. Sydney, well, they're once again the best. They let in 350 returning travellers a day. Victoria, again, is the very worst. It won't let in anyone because these clowns can't trust themselves anymore to run a quarantine hotel. Look at the fatal results last time. Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide, they let in around 500 travellers a week. Labor leader Anthony Albanese today said, well, this is terrible and it's the Morrison government's job to fix it.
He clearly is in charge of our national borders. He clearly is in charge of quarantine issues, and he clearly has access to the infrastructure through the RAAF VIP fleet that could be put in place right now today, bringing home 100 at a time from Europe and bringing home people from the region. I think those who are desperate to get home should be brought home in September.
But this seems like one more of these things like the borders. You know, no one political leader wants to take the responsibility and you know, move for reform. No one wants to really be in charge in this regard. The head of Australian Border Force today said, look, how can we, because they maintain the borders obviously, how can we let in more people if the states won't lift their caps?
If that cap was to double overnight, we'd be delighted, and we could certainly facilitate those people through the border. I've got no doubt that the airlines would take up the additional capacity. So I certainly hope that they're back this side of Christmas, and I certainly hope that the quarantine, the caps, that we can see some increases in some of the states around those caps.
Joining me is Sky News reporter ANDREA CROTHERS, who's been speaking to some of the victims of this incompetence. ANDREA, thanks for joining me. Whose fault is this?
Well, Andrew, there's certainly been a lot of finger-pointing. We obviously know Australia's borders are ultimately the responsibility of the federal government, but the issue is also that this hotel quarantine scheme is being handled by individual states and territories. This limit, which was imposed on the number of travellers returning back to Australia, number of citizens returning back to Australia, was actually also a national cabinet decision. Of course, coming after Victoria had to stop its international flights due to this second wave, all stemming from the hotel quarantine debacle.
Just before he died, my mother, unfortunately, who's in Melbourne, had a very nasty episode which nearly killed her, and she's now got a very, very nasty heart condition, which I would like to get back for, obviously, especially having just lost one parent.
Yeah, well, it seems from that grab, ANDREA, That was Matt Harris, was it? It seems from that grab that the sympathy that, you know, a lot of people are saying, oh, I haven't got any sympathy for them. They were warned to come back, you know, and they didn't, and they waited too long, so let them stay. But that isn't the case when you hear examples like that, is it?
No, so Matt Harris, he is a Melbourne man. He flew back to the UK in January to be with his dying father. And as you heard there, it was whilst he was there and stuck over there waiting to try and get back to Australia that his mother here in Melbourne then took a turn for the worse. So now he's battling. He's had 7 cancelled flights. He's got 2 more booked, one of which is actually a business class flight. Many people are forking out this sort of money to try and jump ahead of the queue. But even then, lots of those flights are being dropped. But even over in WA, COVID-free WA, which hasn't had the hotel quarantine debacles as greatly as Victoria, they're also battling. There's a Perth woman, Amanda Bent. She's waiting for her husband Paul to return home. He got an exemption to leave and bury his sister overseas earlier this year, but he also hasn't been able to get home. Amanda's particularly at some trouble with this, given that she actually relies on him for her day-to-day needs.
And I just find myself in complete despair. Like, you know, I just have to go and cry myself to sleep most nights because I just feel absolutely devastated that my husband can't get home and there's absolutely nothing I can do, and nobody in any government official capacity seems to be able to listen.
No, see, this makes me so cross, Andrea. I mean, what would stop the West Australian government, with so few cases over there, to just build an extra quarantine hotel? People are going to pay for their own quarantine anyway, and there's hotels that would need the business. I mean, for heaven's sake. So what hope that the 27,000 or 23,000 Australians trapped overseas, plus the thousands and more who would want to come home, will be back home, say, be able to come home for Christmas?
Well, the government says it's their plan that they'd like as many to come home by Christmas time, but the people I've been talking to overseas have seen even flights from London as far ahead as January being cancelled. So that's sort of really dismissing any hopes they have of being home for Christmas. The government has made it the federal government has made it very clear that they obviously want to lift the caps, but it's all down to the hotels' quarantine systems in the individual states and territories. Now, the South Australian Health Minister said that they're actively looking to try and expand that. New South Wales says they want the other states to bear more of the load. WA says it will also increase its numbers coming in, but it has one condition.
If the Commonwealth could organise some of their defence bases, some of their defence assets, Christmas Island, obviously we would want to work with them to get those facilities up and operational to take Australians returning home.
A government spokesperson has already panned that idea around Christmas Island, but as far as for other federal facilities, they haven't really commented on that as yet. Now, here in Victoria, which was sort of the cause of this travel limit being put in place, we won't have any international flights until at least October 24. It's still unclear, though, as to whether international flights will come back after that and if the hotel quarantine scheme will be up to scratch to go through it for a third time. The Premier today saying that he is hopeful it will be back in place by Christmas. Andrew?
Well, Christmas Island is now being used for immigration detention again, so that can't be used. I mean, for heaven's sake, Andrea, this is just pathetic. It's like these governments don't even, you know, they're so high and mighty now. They should be helping Australian citizens overseas, and I don't know what the hell's going on. Andrea Crothers, thank you so much for that terrific wrap. Now, joining me is one of those 23,000 Australians trapped overseas. His name is Joseph Forgas. He's the Scientia Professor, or a Scientia Professor at the University of New South Wales. They're the very elite professors there. A prominent psychologist, and has now been waiting and waiting and waiting in Hungary to be able to fly home. Joseph, thank you so much for your time. Why are you in Hungary in the first place?
Thank you, Andrew. I had to come to Hungary following the death of my mother. I had to get special foreign affairs permission to leave in the first place. That was in June. And I now find myself stranded here. I'm unable to come home. There are no flights available. My flight has been cancelled. In addition to the death of my mother, I now suffer a very serious problem in being stuck here indefinitely. And
it's
there are,
incredible.
as you say, thousands.
How has this been on your health? Because you've been stuck there for months. How's it been on your health?
Well, it obviously causes a great deal of anxiety when you're in a completely uncertain situation. You don't know when you can come home. And in my case, it's made worse that the COVID epidemic in Hungary is really spreading very rapidly. The Hungarian health system is actually not one that you would have a lot of confidence in. And like many other Australians, there is no health insurance for us because I'm not a local and you cannot buy travel insurance in Australia since March. So essentially, you have a humanitarian disaster all over the world where Australian citizens are stranded in terrible conditions. Their health, their financial situation, their family position, their jobs are ruined as a result of a government decision that simply says you cannot come home. I think this is an unprecedented situation in any democracy and in Australian history. I would not have believed that Australia, and especially a Liberal government, would take a step where they actually stop Australian citizens from returning home.
I can't believe it either, Joe. I mean, I just can't believe it. Now, just look at their excuse, okay? The government say that you can't come back because there's not enough quarantine beds. Do you accept that as an excuse?
No, this is absolute ridiculous nonsense, I have to say. Australia is one of very, very few countries that uses compulsory hotel quarantine to control incoming travelers. Every other country in the world, including all the liberal democracies, do extremely well with other methods. They do testing on arrival, or they use supervised home quarantine, or a number of other methods. But even if Australia decided that you have to be in a supervised quarantine, hotels are not the option of doing it. So I cannot accept the justification that we stop Australian citizens from coming home simply because somebody in a state health department says we don't have enough hotel rooms. That's a ridiculous denial.
They're too damn lazy. They're too damn lazy. They do not want the responsibility. So Australians overseas, they can go suffer and we can't leave either. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Now, Joe, it doesn't, Joe Forgas, it doesn't escape my attention that the irony here, you are sitting in Hungary. I've been to Budapest. They've got a museum of the communist and Nazi horrors and all that. Hungary used to be a communist country. It used to ban people from leaving. How do you explain Australia now having bans on people leaving and returning?
To be honest, Andrew, I simply cannot understand it, particularly because of my background. I was a political refugee from communism 50 years ago, and that was the last time I felt myself in the same totally exposed and powerless position, where a state tells you that your most fundamental human right as a citizen, which is to return to your country, is denied because of a government decision. I find it absolutely incredible that a highly developed liberal democracy like Australia would go down that road without thinking for a moment about the disaster that they're causing in the lives of tens of thousands of Australians with such poor justification as limited hotel quarantine capacity. And if I might add, I also would like to know that when you try to contact the Australian consular officers, both in Canberra and in Vienna, which is the nearest embassy to Budapest, there is absolutely no help. The Canberra consular officers are totally unable to help. They're irritated by the lots of calls they must be getting from people in a similar position to myself. And the government simply washes its hands. It simply says, talk to the airlines. The airlines have no capacity because the government limits their capacity. It's an absolutely unbelievable situation. If I would not go through this, I wouldn't believe it. I mean, that's totalitarianism as far as these 25,000 Australians are concerned. Their human rights are totally violated.
Joe Forgas, you're so right. Look, I'm out of time, but I just need to ask you something because it hasn't escaped my notice that you are, in fact, a very prominent psychologist. Australians, particularly in Victoria, I want to ask you the psychology here. They seem to be accepting the most extreme controls over their freedom in this panic. It's like the coronavirus has been terrifying them into accepting even a curfew in Victoria and home imprisonment, 23 hours out of 24. It's now, but courtesy of the government, we can do 22 hours of 2 hours out of doors a day now. Now, to me, this is a chilling warning that if politicians scare people enough, they can impose what is starting to look, in Victoria at least, like a police state. What has all this told you as a psychologist about Australia?
I absolutely agree with your comments, and I think what it tells us is that the totalitarian tendency is inherent even in liberal democracies, and citizens have to be very, very careful in how far they tolerate this kind of imposition. We all agree that the COVID crisis has to be handled very carefully, but this kind of total violation of human rights and treating people in a way that essentially infantilizes them, it denies them the most basic freedom to make decisions about their lives, that's really, really scary. In some other liberal countries, by the way, in Germany, there have been demonstrations against this. Other countries like Sweden have handled it with far more trust and sensitivity. So in some sense, I have to say I'm deeply disappointed in Australia. And I think what the government has been doing is causing immense damage to our reputation. When you talk to people overseas, you hear, they just cannot believe it. They say, what? They don't allow you to go back? How can that be? It's kind of unbelievable. And what also surprises me that the Australian citizens who are at home take this lightly. If it happens to 25 or 30,000 Australians...
Mate, it's completely confuzzled me as well, you know, this idea that Australians are supposed to be larrikins, not liking authority, you know, that was our traditional image, and now I see that for many Australians they're in fact a bunch of sheep, and particularly in Victoria, the sheep capital of Australia. Joe Forgas, I hope that we will have the pleasure of your company here very quickly. The governments have got to move on this. This is a complete joke and an abrogation of their responsibility. May you return safely.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.